Bible is full of stories that we all know and love. But how well do we know them? The answer might surprise you. The Bible you thought you knew is going to dive deep into the exquisite details of the biblical stories that make them fascinating and transforming. 2 weeks ago, we presented part 1 of a story that is narrated in 1 Samuel chapter 25. This story features the rich but surly man, Nabal, and his intelligent and beautiful wife, Abigail. We recall that Nabal's servants were taking care of his sheep business. David had sent 10 men to remind him that his shepherds were under the protection of David's men, which is why they had been safe and lost no animals. In return, David wanted a hefty donation. However, Nabal had neither asked for or paid for this so-called protection. So, he insulted David by, in effect, calling him a criminal who was trying his hand at extortion. When David's men told him how Nabal had responded, he told his men to put on their swords, saddle up, and head for Nabal. David intended to kill Nabal's servants, and presumably Nabal as well. Keep in mind that Nabal's name means fool. It was certainly foolish to insult a man like David, who was backed up by serious muscle. As David and his men were heading for where Nabal and his servants were, Abigail got wind of what Nabal had said. She countered by putting together a lavish gift that she planned to present to David. She enlisted some of her husband's men to help her as they prepared to meet David. Of course, she said nothing to Nabal about this ploy. As soon as Abigail saw David, she dismounted her ass, fell on her face at David's feet, indicating both extreme deference and surrender. That's in verse 23 of chapter 25. When she spoke, she asked David to blame her alone. She told David that Nabal was the sort of man who did not have the sense to act properly. Had she been around when David's men initially made their request, they would have received a very different answer. She even pointed out that Nabal, after all, means fool, and that her husband's behavior shows that he had been well named. That's verses 24 and 25. But Abigail did not stop with those remarks. She went on to tell David that it was to his benefit that he had not avenged himself for Nabal's response. Had David done so, that might not have been good optics for him in the public perception. Abigail also noted that David would be better off for his enemies to be as foolish as Nabal had been. At that juncture, she urged David to accept the present she had put together. She also asked David to forgive her, even though she had done nothing wrong. As well, she opined that Israel's God would surely make David a sure house, meaning a stable dynasty, since he was fighting the Lord's battles. Abigail even went so far as to say that no evil would be found in David for the duration of his life. That's in verses 26 through 28. She continued this peroration by telling David that the Lord would certainly protect him from any potential enemies. In addition, once the Lord has appointed David to be Israel's prince, David will be glad that he need not grieve about or have any pangs of conscience about the fact that he avenged himself at Nabal's expense. By the way, Abigail went on, when all these good things happened to you at the Lord's instigation, she sincerely hoped that David would remember her and her gesture fondly. That's in verses 30 through 31. Clearly, Abigail was a sagacious woman. She knew how to deal with a powerful man who had been disrespected. She not only flattered David, but predicted an excellent outcome for his long-term political future. Of course, she had also given him and his men an excellent present. She figured that what she did and what she said would make up for Nabal's stupidity. Abigail's efforts to reverse the effects of Nabal's rejection of David's offer worked. According to David, what Abigail did and said had to include divine involvement. That's in verse 32. David thanked Abigail most of all for intervening in this pending conflict and therefore keeping him from avenging Nabal's insult. Indeed, David admitted that, had not Abigail taken action to convince him to act other than his original intention, a bloodbath would have ensued. That's in verses 33 and 34. After this admission, David accepted Abigail's gift and sent her away with a message of peace. He said specifically that he had listened to her voice and decided to grant her petition. The petition must have referred to Abigail's pleading with David to forego violence. That's in verse 35. At this point in the unfolding drama, Abigail went to see her husband, Nabal. He was at the time holding a feast in his home, like the feast of a king, the narrator pointedly tells his readers. Clearly, Nabal's wealth is being emphasized, not to mention perhaps his greed and sense of entitlement. He was adamant about not giving a thing to David and his gang. Even if the request was a veiled threat on David's part, Nabal might have been more sensitive to the precarious situation he had to deal with. After all, David had muscle behind him. Would it not have been a wise move to give some of his wealth to David rather than refusing him outright and insulting him to boot? In any case, when Abigail got to the house, Nabal was already 4 sheets to the wind. That is, he was drunk. Abigail had to wait until the next morning to talk with him. That's in verse 36. In the morning, Nabal was sober. That was when Abigail told him what had transpired with David. Of course, this would include her stating that, had it not been for her mollifying David with her present, David would not have spared a single man who worked for Nabal. Almost certainly, Nabal himself would not have been spared. After all, he was the one who disparaged David. Nabal's reaction to Abigail's report stupefied him. It was as though he had become a stone. That's in verses 36 and 37. 10 days later, the Israelite deity intervened by taking Nabal's life. That's in verse 38. The Nabal saga was concluded. When David heard about Nabal's demise, he provided the whole episode with a theological commentary. He praised God for avenging the insult that Nabal had thrown at him. He was even grateful that God had seen to Nabal's death, thus keeping David from having a blot on his ledger. From David's perspective, Nabal was responsible for his own death. He was extremely wealthy, but he only thought of himself. Under no circumstances would he share any bounty with David, regardless of the fact that David and his men had protected Nabal's interests. According to David, this man deserved his fate. That's in verse 39. Once Nabal was out of the way, his widow, Abigail, was fair game for David. So he began a courtship. Leaving no doubt about his intentions, he sent servants to Abigail. They had a very different message than the one the 10 men delivered to Nabal at the beginning of the story. The servants did not beat around the bush. They made Abigail realize that David wanted her to become his wife. She responded by bowing and offering to wash the feet of David's servants. That was Abigail's way of saying yes to David's proposal. Without hesitation, Abigail returned with David's servants and became his wife. Because she was a woman of means, she took 5 maidens who were attendants with her. That's in verses 40 through 42. The chapter ends with the notation that David at the same time took another wife, Ahinoam of Jezreel. These 2 wives were to compensate for the fact that Saul had taken back his daughter, Michal, from David and given her to another man. Michal, of course, had been David's wife. What are we to make of this story? On the surface, it is not difficult to distinguish between attractive characters and unattractive characters. The story is disposed toward Abigail, who is beautiful and intelligent, and not disposed toward Nabal, who is foolish, ill-mannered, and profligate. David, for some time, has been measured against Saul. Saul is increasingly described in negative terms, while David is increasingly described in positive terms. But that is only on the surface. What should we make about how the story of David, Nabal, and Abigail is framed? The narrative, remember, begins by noting Samuel's death and burial, and Israel's mourning that event. From the beginning of 1 Samuel, this prophet had been a principal character who has brought the prophetic voice into the narrated affairs. What difference does it make that this particular episode needs to begin with the notation of this prophet's death and burial, as well as Israel's reaction to his passing? And what are we to make of the fact that the chapter concludes by letting us know that besides Abigail, David took another wife, Ahinoam? Both these women somehow compensated for David's losing his first wife, Michal, who was Saul's daughter. Are these 2 frames incidental or consequential? It is also fair to ask how the narrator is making his take on the situation known. There is no question that the Israelite God killed Nabal. That is stated clearly and explicitly in verse 38. What was Nabal's crime? Or what was his sin? Was he expected to give David whatever he asked for when the 10 men first came to him? Was his refusal to meet David's requests the sin for which he was ultimately punished? He also insulted David by implying that he was one of many people running away from their masters. That was not a smart move, to be sure, but was it serious enough to merit death? Also, when David provided his commentary on the incident, he cited only that God's killing Nabal was revenge for the insult. Nothing is mentioned about withholding goods. Why does David omit that detail? These are all difficult questions. I have a few preliminary observations. 1, it is hardly accidental that this episode begins with Samuel's death. This means at least that prophetic perspective will be missing. 2, Nabal is hardly a sympathetic character. At the same time, is his being a fool, churlish, or ill-mannered a reason for David to exploit the fact that he happens to be rich. Granted, his insulting David, refusing to give anything to him, or celebrating like a king, makes him look like a selfish, bumbling buffoon. But did that behavior warrant such a severe punishment? 3. Given the kinds of men that David had gathered around him, people in distress, people in debt, people who were discontented, was Nabal so wrong to refuse their request? It is hard not to see David's actions as extortion, since Nabal neither asked for nor paid for protection. Also, why did David have to ask for so much? Quote, everything that you have at hand, end of quote. 3. Why did the narrator make a point of supplying the moral or theological interpretation? He left that up to David, hardly a disinterested character. Finally, what are we to make of how quickly David got Abigail to be his wife? What is the point of letting us know about how David lost his first wife and gained another in Ahinoam? Did this adumbrate the sorts of difficulties that David would later have with his own family, including his own children? Let me encourage you to go to my website, faspina.com. Let me know what your email is so that I can contact you. If you have a question that you would like me to answer in a Q&A session, email me at fspina106@gmail.com. I want to thank you so very much for listening to The Bible You Thought You Knew. I have a question for you. Do you have a question or topic that you'd like me to cover on the podcast? If so, all you need to do is head over to Apple Podcasts and do 2 simple things. 1, leave a rating and review telling me what you think of the podcast. 2, in that review, ask anything you want related to the Bible. That's all you have to do. Then, listen in to hear your question answered on a future episode. Join us next time on The Bible You Thought You Knew when we discuss Jesus' personal Bible. God bless.